Um, I am really pleased to have Grady back. Grady is got such a fund of knowledge and experience, and then he gets himself into things that you wouldn't think, uh, perhaps that a working engineer would have time for, but he thinks about clean audio. He thinks about what radio stations can do to hold on to listeners these days. And that's where we come today with a possible solution to a problem. And let's listen to what Grady has to say and see if we can learn something. Grady?
I'm really happy to see how many people have shown up today. Um, it's kind of like you throw a party and you invite everybody, and then you sell 13 tickets, and you wonder why the auditorium is empty. And so today really makes me feel good. I have a lot of respect for a lot of the people that I see on the screen, and I'm really pleased that I can share what I've got here to share with you. I want to start out by saying I'm not an expert about anything. I'm not a has-been, I don't think, and I'm not a drip under pressure. So I am an experimenter, though, and for that reason, hang on a minute, let me see if I can do this. Gonna do that. Boom. My situation is that I'm very much in my head like this guy. And how come is it not? Oh,
Mr. Blue Screen.
I, I, I think of myself like that guy. I'm not necessarily smarter than the average bear, but I've seen what I've seen, and I've had access to the stuff I've had access to, and my brain asks questions and it wants to know stuff, and it does a heck of a lot of research to find out what other people have to say about it, and then I'll bounce off of that and go do some stuff on my own. So that's what today is about. And so single sideband FM stereo has been something that I've been interested in for quite a while, ever since it first came up. But before that came up, there was an article in Broadcast Engineering magazine back in February of 1974. Some guy at WLS had written it, and I learned a whole bunch of things back then. I had just come to Houston, Texas, to move KIKK to One Shell Plaza, and that was my first FM radio station job. So I had a lot to learn about FM in that year. But we'll come to him in a minute, because I think it'd be better if we look at this. Single sideband stereo is not about multipath. It never has been. It's about backward compatibility with monaural FM using technology that we had in 1961. We couldn't do anything in the future with the things that we can do now with computers and digital signal processing. All we had was the technology that we had. The system that they came up with for backward compatibility is, therefore, pretty magical. It worked pretty well. But this is also about group delay effects on the existing FM stereo system and ways to mitigate those resulting audio artifacts. And it turns out that in the 80s, a lot of research was done about that by people that we have a great amount of respect for. So I thought maybe let's go through a few white papers from the 80s from a well-known FM transmitter engineer. I got permission from Jeff Mendenhall to use a few pages out of 3 different white papers that he did while he was at Broadcast Electronics, because this 33-page paper in 1980 taught me more than I learned from any other single source at that time in my life. It's really dense with information. I only took a couple of pages out of it. Here's one. It explains when you're matrixing your audio and you've got an L plus R and an L minus R, and your idea for getting back to having left channel and right channel is to take the L minus R and be able to add it linearly and subtract it linearly to and from the L plus R, which is, of course, the legacy FM that we have to be compatible with. These are the formulas that show you how quickly you get into an error situation. I'm not going to get into the math there, but the fact that Jeff did blew my mind. And then the other thing that I'm going to take out of that paper is this, because I didn't understand this until I saw this particular image. But it makes it very clear that what's really happening here is we take the left channel and the right channel and we add them together, and we modulate the carrier with that signal 6 dB down from 100% modulation. Then we take the left channel and the right channel and we add them together again, except we reverse the phase of the right channel so that the center information cancels and we're left with only separation information. It's important to remember, however, that this is a monaural signal. All it is a single audio channel. And then that single audio channel is used to modulate a 38 kilohertz carrier with amplitude modulation, and then they strip out the carrier so that there's nothing left but the upper and lower sidebands of the L-R audio after it's modulated the 38 kilohertz. And the result is 2 additional pieces of information, and these are just sine waves. In this case, it's 5 kilohertz. So this is minus 12, 5 kilohertz below 38, and this is minus 12 above 38 kilohertz. Getting this picture into your head and then seeing what happens after this happens, I think is critical to understanding why single sideband stereo does make changes to what we hear. And the only question is, how can we maximize the improvement and minimize any degradation that those changes cause? This picture of the 67 kilohertz subcarrier is just there to be complete. So then in 1985, Jeff did another paper. And this was extremely interesting because it talks about group delay, but it doesn't even use those words except for one place in the entire paper. I guess that hadn't become a really acceptable or well-known term at the level of the people he was writing for. This is what I got out of there. This is showing what happens when you frequency modulate an RF carrier and it's centered in the passband of all of the tuned circuits between the exciter and the receiver in the dashboard or wherever it is. In this case, it's only showing a single curve, which we can assume is the PA amplifier output tuning and loading circuit. The way this image shows is that if you're centered in the passband of whatever it is, in this case it's a symmetrical PA output network, what you get is second harmonic information caused by amplitude modulation. This doesn't even talk about the phase modulation that's happening to the energy in the sidebands as it slams into the edges of the filter. It only shows the amplitude modulation changes, but you can see what happens if the FM carrier is off here to the side. Instead of getting a little bit of second harmonic AM, you get a lot of AM at the same frequencies as the audio, and it's called incidental modulation. We fought this for years. So seeing this picture, we may come back to it later, but if you burn it into your head right now, we may not have to do that. This is just a diagram of what Jeff showed that he was using to make these various measurements in the papers that he did. I included it to show the thoroughness of the science that this man was doing. Then here's an article in 1989 from the same company. Jeff is not listed as an author in it, but he was still there. So I imagine he had his hand in it from time to time. This was design of tube amplifiers for optimum FM transmitter performance, and this was when Broadcast Electronics introduced what is arguably the first PA cavity that, when tuned for maximum efficiency, was also tuned as close to the center of the passband as possible with the RF filtering. The folded half-wave coax cavity with inductive tuning and magnetic output coupling loop. When this transmitter came out, I stopped making a whole bunch of money. I used to, based on his earlier writing, I used to get on airplanes and fly to markets and get paid thousands of dollars just because I knew how to tune a transmitter where, rather than for efficiency only, to find the sweet spot where my bandwidth and my efficiency were kind of in the best place to get as good a performance out of both of them. So, then there's the last paper that I have of Jeff's, Improving FM Modulation Performance by Tuning for Symmetrical Group Delay, and this paper now talks about group delay with this phrase repeatedly out into the open. The only thing I'm going to show in there is his abstract. Take a minute and read that. If it was so important to get your group delay match and symmetricity working to make your audio sound good in 1990, why would it become less important now, what, 35 years later? I don't think it does. I think that, that we're constantly looking for ways to solve that problem. Now let's go back to 1974 to that article from that guy at WLS who later became a close friend of all of ours. Glenn Clark wrote this article. There's not even a picture of him in Broadcast Engineering magazine. There's a picture of another WLS engineer in there. He didn't have much of an ego back then. And to a great extent, I think he didn't have much of an ego all the way through his life. He was too concentrated on the science that he was living in and doing all the amazing things that he did. This, once again, this paper only talks about the amplitude modulation caused as the frequency modulated carrier swings back and forth into the skirts of this filter. But every time there's amplitude modulation occurring, as was expressed in Jeff's paper that I was in a minute ago in the text, there's more group delay phase angle stuff going on than there is amplitude stuff. And that is the big problem with trying to use what we invented in 1961 to come up with the ability to keep all the mono FM radios still working while adding stereo without having anybody throw anything in the trash. So now I'm going to move into some stuff that I put together when I wrote an article based on this using Glenn Clark's image. And after I wrote it, I looked at it and I said, you know, people are just going to laugh at this, and I put it in a folder on my computer and never did anything with it. People have told me I shouldn't have done that, and maybe I shouldn't have. So Barry finally convinced me that maybe I should drag this stuff out and do something with it now. So here we go. This is once again looking at the L plus R modulated with plain old FM and the L minus R in a double sideband suppressed carrier situation and showing where the energy actually is. But we can't actually see what audio is where in this diagram, so I did this. As you can see, as it is with all modulation that we know about that is not digital in some form, all analog modulation, both FM and AM, the lowest frequency modulation energy is closest to the center of your channel, closest to the carrier, and the higher the pitch, the higher the frequency, the further out it is. And therefore, the more vulnerable it is to amplitude modulation caused by it being out on the skirts of your passband, and phase modulation, and therefore group delay. But out here in the 38 kilohertz, your base is either side of the 38 kilohertz carrier location. It's not in here. And as you go in toward the FM carrier or out toward the edge of the passband of the radio station, you're going higher and higher in frequency. In this case, as you move inward, it's actually a good thing, because as the frequency of the audio that we want to recover by cancellation, to make the left channel go away when we want right channel, or to make the right channel go away when we want left channel, the phase and the amplitude become more critical to proper cancellation. But out here, the highs are in the worst possible, most vulnerable place when your main carrier is slamming into the sides of whatever the sum total of the passband of all the filters between you and going through your antenna are going to introduce into that. And remember, there was a decade or more when many FM antennas, FM transmitting antennas, were actually off-tuned on the high side, so that when they iced up, they would go through a good match before the transmitter started to see reflected power that would cause it to start to turn its power down. I never liked that idea, even if it's not a big deal, even if it's only a small effect. Why would I want to sound a little funky for 300 days a year just so I can not have transmitter problems for the other 65 days a year? That was just what my head did with it. But, you know, I could be wrong. I have been many times. We'll move forward now and place this onto Glenn Clark's image. No, we won't. The next step is to show what happens. This business, really, it's just audio. Yes, this is an amplitude modulated 38 kilohertz carrier with the carrier removed, but in fact, it is AM, it's audio, it's in there with plain old audio here, and when this modulates the FM carrier, that's what it is. It's audio. Now, we see that when this gets transmitted, there are 4 complete copies of the L-R signal. There's one in the inner side of the 38 kilohertz, there's one on the outer side of the 38 kilohertz, and then there's an image of this on this side of the FM carrier. And when this side slams into the filter because the frequency has momentarily gone low, then this one is near the center. And then when this one slams into the high side of the filter's response curve, this one's in the center, and really none of these incidents of the L-R information are in the same environment. So the group delay issue is critical to these signals properly adding to create L times 2 and subtracting to create R0. And this is how it looks when you put it on top of Glenn Clark's image. As you can see, the outer half of the 38 kilohertz puts more vulnerable, more fragile information out further to the low side and the high side, where the most damage can be done by the tuned circuit or circuits that the FM carrier is going to traverse before it gets out the antenna and out to the listener's radio. And by the way, tuned circuits in the listener's radio also have an effect on this. It's just that we have no control over that at all. So let's move on and see why this is a problem that we could solve. The problem is we can't make the receivers change their bandwidth when we take energy out of this area or this area. All we can do is take the energy out so that this energy doesn't cause a problem when it is included in the information to try to create left or right by dematrixing the L plus R and the L minus R with the mono. This is what that looks like. And this is what that looks like on Glenn Clark's image. Now you can see that as the audio frequency increases and the 38 kilohertz sidebands on the inside since the way this works is as the frequency increases, the modulation of the 38 kilohertz actually moves in closer to the center of the FM radio station's carrier and closer to where the high frequencies are in the L plus R. The group delay issues between these two places where 10 to 15 kilohertz are and these two places where 10 to 15 kilohertz are and these two places where those two signals are mirror images of each other is dramatically lower than when you try to take this energy and include it. And the problem is the receivers can't do anything about that. The receivers, the original design of the receiver, if you remember way back that day, was let's take the 19 kilohertz, pilot, let's double it. Let's insert it into the 38 kilohertz double sideband suppressed carrier and just demodulate the AM and then use that audio. So using the standard way that all those old analog FM radios did, we're stuck with the fact that all the energy is just summed and then it's used to try to dematrix with the L plus R. So now that we've looked at those issues, and I'm hoping this generates a conversation later. If I'm not looking at this right, I really want to know about it. But it's been embedded in my head now for over 20 years, and so that's why I'm almost barking now, in spite of the fact that I've been ill for 3 weeks and I'm on antibiotics. Let's move on to actual measurements. Tuesday of this week, I went out to the WUMB transmitter site and I put all of the network on our backup audio processor, and then I used our main audio processor to actually run test tones through an audio processor that we have that is arguably the most flexible FM audio processor presently available. I like this audio processor a lot. I might not like some of the sound signatures that come out of it that some radio stations choose in major markets, but that doesn't matter. The fact is that the box that I was able to use, because we happen to have one, has better internal monitoring of its functions and better control over the routing of its signals than any other FM audio processor I've ever worked with. As a matter of fact, let me just talk about that for a second. Back in the 80s, I developed public radio membership software using Borland Paradox and Quattro Pro, just as they were developing something that became well known called object-oriented code. And the idea behind that was, instead of writing a big piece of code that does everything, let's write these little modules and then have hooks on each module to get into and out of them with controls and requests for performance and signals in and signals out. And that way the blocks can be more universal. They can be used in more places. Well, guess what? Life Clayson did that with what we sell in America as the Omnia.9. It is an object-oriented audio processor. He's got all of the stuff in there broken up into processing blocks. And then those blocks, with their inputs and their outputs and their controls and their cross connections, there's a very, very interesting way to route different things to different things and do some pretty amazing things with it. My only problem with this audio processor is that I can't wrap my head around the organization of the menu system. But that's not life's problem. It's my bad, because with flexibility comes complexity. It's very difficult to have a box that can do all these great things, but it can't read your mind. So you have to talk its language to get what you want out of it. Fortunately, I've been working with the .9 at WUMB's main transmitter site in Quincy, which is the TOC that feeds all of the other network transmitter sites, and they all get their audio out of the .9. So let's move into the measurements. You're looking at a screen in an Omnia.9. I made a test file, put it on an old Marantz CD player. It is left channel only. It starts at 50 hertz. Then it gives us 100, 400, 1000, 4,000, 10,000, and 14 kilohertz. Every time it's just left channel. And we can see in this beautiful screen here exactly where the energy falls. It took me about an hour to get the videos on my laptop. I spent 3 times that editing them down to try to get a consistent amount of time in every one of these videos between each tone and the image that you see, and to try to make it pretty fast to get through it, because there is a lot of information here. And Barry, I will stop if you want me to. We could turn this into another show at another day from this point, but I can start here if and do what I had intended to do if everybody's still hooked in and interested.
Nope, carry on.
Okay. I'm going to click the start button, and what's going to happen is you're going to see, and here it is. It's hard to keep that image on the screen. How do I get that back? This is 50 hertz, and those tones are so close together about the 38 kilohertz carrier location that you cannot see them as separate spikes. It looks like there's a 38 kilohertz carrier there, but there is not. Let's see if, no, you see, when I'm in this screen, it makes me go places I don't want to go. Now it's going to go to 100 hertz. No, now it's going to blow up, and you can see that there's probably 2 spikes there. And now I go back out. Now we're going to go to 100. And now if I pause it, oh, wait, no. Wait till it blows up. Now you can see that there are 2 spikes, and they are equal amplitude. And you can see that the top of each one of those spikes, one above 38 and one below 38, are exactly 6 dB below the L plus R. It's very clear here exactly what's happening. And as long as this relationship occurs, you'll get really good left and right channel stereo output out of this thing. Okay, we'll keep going. Let's see if I can keep my little bar graph at the bottom. If it disappears, I'm in trouble. Now it switches to 400. And then it's going to expand back. Now what? No, I don't want that. It did it again. Oh, this is the single sideband one. See, I've gotten into the next one. All right, this is where I want to be. It's hard to control this thing. And there goes my bar that lets me control it again. How do I get, oh, I just have to move the cursor around a lot. All right, there's 400, and it's about to expand, if it hasn't already. Oh, it paused. All right, now you can see again, 2 400 hertz spikes, one above and below 38, 6 dB down from where the L plus R is over at the left. Now we're going to switch to a kilohertz, and we see once again that it's the same. And this is double sideband suppressed carrier. It's basically standard stereo like we've been doing since 1961. Now we're going to go to 4 kilohertz. Same thing. Then we're going to go to 10 kilohertz. Did it pause again? No, it didn't. There's, now we've gone to 10 kilohertz. You can still see that 6 dB from the L minus R spikes to the L plus R. And now it goes to 14 kilohertz. And now it becomes interesting because you can see just how far apart The identical information is in the 38 kilohertz double sideband suppressed carrier. This energy is not going to be harmed nearly as much by filter problems at the edge of the passband of the radio station as this one is. So let's go finish it here. It'll be over soon. And there we are. Now let's move on to the very first version. No, did it repeat? It did. This is the very first version of single sideband stereo. I call it brick wall. There's essentially nothing above 38 kilohertz. And the problem with this turned out to be that there was a series of radios built in Europe using a European chipset. And this is what I hear. I don't have any personal knowledge of it, but this is what I've heard. And the problem is that those automobiles from Europe, those radios turned out to be some of the ones that had a problem with brick wall single sideband. Let's go look at what that looks like. We're once again going to run the same tones through the same cycle. This is 50 hertz. Hundred hertz. 400 hertz. But now, let's pause it. There's a difference in the amplitude of the two 400 hertz audio sidebands of the 38 kilohertz. This one is higher and that one is lower, and that's because this is right on the cusp of where the filter that gets rid of the high side sidebands of the 38 kilohertz starts to work. But when that happens, because this one is dropped, this one has been raised to compensate so that still the sum of the energy in the two sidebands of the 38 kilohertz still perfectly matches what it needs to cancel over here. Keep going. And in the very next one, you'll see that there's nothing on the outer sideband of the 38 kilohertz when it makes the change. It's just gone. It's gone. But now you can see that the amplitude of the sideband that's still there has been increased to match what's in the L plus R. There's like 1 pixel's difference in the tops of these, so it looks like the L plus R is a little taller, but that's just a problem in the video image. I mean, we can just keep on skipping out here and looking at it, and you can see it's completely empty out there. Imagine how a chipset would act if it was expecting to see energy out here and it didn't see it. It would probably automatically go to some kind of, well, we're going to go to mono mode so it won't sound so bad. And that is where the problem with compatibility was first seen. It's unfortunate that in America we pretty much walked away from this. Get it going. We'll just be complete and go all the way out to the end. And there is 14 kilohertz. All right, we're done here. Let's now go to version 2. Version 2 is called, hang on a minute, can I make that go away? Well, it doesn't matter, I'm the only one who can see it, so I'm going to drop that down so I can see the top of my window. This is what they call, in the .9, it's called 12K sharp. And what I think that means is that there is a low-pass filter at 12K above 38 kilohertz, and it makes everything above that go away. And when it does, there's a compensatory increase in the levels of what's down here on the inside. And we're going to do the same thing again. We're just going to start it, and you're going to see 400, and you're going to see that this is up until it gets to above 10 kilohertz, it's exactly the same as plain old stereo. It's exactly the same. It is my opinion that this was developed in Europe to specifically solve the problem with the radios with that chipset, and you can see why it might as we go through it. If that's pretty clear, I think I'll just go ahead and bounce through this a little more to save some time. All right. 10 kilohertz. Right here, you start to see a difference in the amplitude of the upper and lower 38 kilohertz sidebands. And when it goes to 14, boom, it's gone. And now the amplitude of this one is exactly the same as the L plus R that it needs to cancel with. So this 12K sharp, I believe when I got my .9, it had this one in it, and it didn't have the one that I'm about to show you. And that's the one that I think is really the solution to making single sideband stereo work really, really well. So let's go to the next image. It's called 12K Smooth. And rather than talking, this is where you select, but by the way, this is the menu in the .9 where you can select the various single sideband modes that the box will do. And it's in home, system, IO options, FM options, multiplex. And the stuff that you have to be in to do the other things that I was doing is a completely different menu tree. And there is a way, if you're intimately involved with this processor, to be able to jump back and forth between different menu screens that are at different points in each of those trees. I just don't work with this particular box enough. I've got so many boxes at so many stations that I have to keep in mind that I can't remember that myself. And again, that's not a fault of this processor. It's my fault. So there you go. We're going to start playing this now. This is our last set of measurements. I'm kind of happy that we made it this far. There comes, is it still going? Yes, it is. I need to try to keep this on the screen here. Now we go to 100. Still, this is exactly like plain old 1961 FM stereo until you get up to around 10 kilohertz. And that's where you start to see differences between the upper and lower sidebands of the 38 kilohertz L-R. And that's the nice thing about it. With a smooth crossover between one mode and the other, I believe that the receivers work better. But that's just, I have no proof of that. I don't have time to go out and money to go out and rent a whole bunch of cars, put test equipment in the back. But here we are, this is 4 kilohertz, and you can already see there's like a 8 dB difference between the upper and the lower sidebands of the 38 kilohertz. And as it keeps playing out, it'll go to 10 kilohertz. And there's still energy out there on the outside, but it's down about maybe 20 dB now. This energy still being there makes the radio receiver happy, so it doesn't think it needs to do anything to fix a problem that doesn't really exist. But because this energy is well over 10 dB lower than this energy, and this energy is now almost exactly what needs to cancel with the L plus R to make the signal that we, the channel that we don't want to be there go away, all of the math that's happening in that dematrixing turns out to be between these two. And remember, because these are so close together, near the center channel of the main FM radio carrier, there's a lot less group delay difference between these two than there is between this one and either one of these. So let's go ahead and let it play out. There's only one more. It goes to 14 kilohertz, and then you see that it's gone. But the shape of that curve out here is very interesting to me. It's a very interesting curve. All right, let's see where I am. This is very close to the end of the whole presentation. And there's the end of the presentation. I want to give a few thanks here. I had a lot of help from Barry discussing the basic structure that this thing would have. I got Brad Parsons and John Garrett to actually let me run through this with them yesterday, and I made major changes to this presentation based on their comments. And I'd like to thank my PowerPoint guru, Pat Monteith, who is a NASA Solar System ambassador and does all kinds of other things with local community groups that she's in. She's doing 8 or 10 PowerPoints a week, and she actually helped me build this and got the fine points of it working as well as it does done for me, so that I could focus on the information and not have to focus on a, why don't I understand PowerPoint better? And my last thanks goes to this guy. Oops. I visited him when he wasn't far from the end of his life, and we went to dinner, and we sat and talked about all kinds of things, and he showed me his big array of computers that he had built after he got rid of his Cray computer. And I think he designed a major directional array that's in Detroit that some people say they don't know how it got designed. And it got designed because this was a parallel processing, almost artificial intelligence kind of a thing, because instead of using pair multiplication to come up with the pattern, he had a piece of land. He knew how big it was. So he put tower locations on that land that he thought might be positioned in such a way that a pattern could be made. Then he gave the control computer that gave these other 100 computers their little jobs to do piecemeal, and gave it the go. And it started from a starting point, and it would just keep iterating until it got to some point where either it was getting closer to the goal that he had set it, or it was no longer doing that. And then he turned around, went back to the start, and started it iterating in a different direction. And he told me that it was a really interesting process to go through, because once he got a pattern to work, the next step for him was to then see if he could drive one of the towers to zero field, because then he doesn't have to build the tower. He doesn't have to build that leg of the phasing and branching system, and it actually probably becomes more stable in the process. This man is another genius that I was very fortunate to get to rub shoulders with from time to time, and we're all sad that he's gone. I'm done.
Very cool. I like the way you put the pictures in there to show what was going on in your mind. I mean, it's kind of nice to see. I kind of thought of it the same way you did when it comes to that kind of stuff. So great job. Glad Barry talked you into it.
This brought back some memories for me of trying to minimize the synchronous AM component on an old Collins Twin 20 combined transmitter with the original tube IPA. It was, but as I look at this, I guess, first of all, it's a lot to digest. I'm really, congratulations for really engaging my brain in a way that it hasn't been engaged for a while. I'm wondering a little about, because FM is, one thing that I kept kind of wondering is FM is sort of a, well, it's not sort of a, it's kind of a phony method in that it has a variable modulation index. As you know, as you go down, the mod index gets higher, and you go up, it gets lower. And I was noticing that when I was tuning stuff. I guess with what you're doing, that really doesn't matter, but I'm wondering if you would care to comment on anything about that.
That's a very important thing to note, Chris. I decided to not get involved in Bessel functions and talking about how every time you have a modulation index of, I think I'm getting this right, higher than 1, you start to have multiple copies of the sideband information that go further out. And the levels of that information drop as you go out, and apparently as long as you have out to the first 2 sets going through your passband, you don't have enough distortion in the received signal to get more than around 1% harmonic distortion or something like that. I'm just pulling this out of my head from a long time ago, and it's probably not accurate. But the idea here is that as you go out, the effect of the additional information on the FM carrier becomes less and less.
Okay.
Chris, I'm going to jump in and mention that I've asked Grady to reduce this to some written material as well, so that it can be digested a little more easily, perhaps. It won't happen immediately, but he's promised he will do that for us.
Say the other important thing about what you're showing there, in general, is how that the bandwidth of your antenna system and the transmitter would play in having a role of what your station is going to sound like. And so when I ran into this with once consolidation happened and I had more than just my one signal, and you get a hold of stations that were across town and all that. And, for years you always wondered, well, why can't they make that sound any better? And once I get a hold of it, no matter what I did, it always sounded pretty much the same. You can make the basic sound change, but there's still this sound that just changed. And it's not until you change out the transmitter systems and the antennas and replace them with stuff with sufficient bandwidth that you actually move the needle on the sound of a station. So this is a great way to
seems like this would
that.
Seems like it would also help multipath issues as kind of a extra benefit.
Well, that's exactly what we're talking about. Remember that we can't control the bandwidth of the receiver. It's either in mono mode and goes out to 15, or it's in stereo mode and it goes out to like 55 or whatever. And when it's out at 55, we can't make the noise that's in the channel from 38 to 55 to go away. But if we don't excite the problem by putting stuff in there that then makes noise because it's slamming again into the sides of the filters, we've at least cleaned up that part of it. So the products of this sound a lot like multipath before you even put it on the FM carrier. Then when you put it on an FM carrier and there is multipath, then you hear the multipath effects being affected by the problems with the double sideband suppressed carrier approach. I agree.
I always thought of that as self-multipath.
Well, Grady, I realize that all of our heads would explode if you went hard into Bessel functions, because that's math that I learned 40 or 50 or whatever years ago and have forgotten how to do. But the reality is that the charts that you showed showing plus and minus 75 kilohertz, it's really plus and minus 120 kilohertz because our bandwidth FM channel is 240 kilohertz wide. In the Bessel null, the Bessel functions with complex, it's hard enough to do Bessel with a sine wave. When you start putting in complex waveform like composite stereo or music, I don't know how big a computer you need to actually calculate what this is, but you're looking at an infinite number of sidebands all changing dynamically very fast, depending on the actual spectral content of that instant. So it's a little harder to see that than just a simple 75 plus and minus 75 kilohertz. That's the deviation. That's not the occupied bandwidth. So when you're looking at level, in other words, audio level, RF level from minus to plus through the entire occupied bandwidth, you really have to at least understand that the Bessel functions are more critical than that. But going back to my misguided youth, one of my mentors is a guy named Bob Beamish. And at that time, he was at KABL FM. They had a BTF 40E, which if anybody's ever had experience with that, you will groan, because that was two narrowband transmitters that were paralleled, and getting them to behave across the entire bandwidth and have minimal amplitude modulation was just about impossible. But Bob found that if he tuned them almost daily for minimum incidental AM, the multipath in the field was much reduced, because he was now actually transmitting a clean FM rather than the two transmitters fighting each other. I don't think anybody could ever make a 40E sound good.
And those FM transmitters also turned into fireboxes. I showed up the very next day after one burned here in Boston, because one of my clients had a studio to transmitter link that had a microwave shot that originated from the top of that building. And I went up there just to work on my 111C repeat coils, and the smell was awful, and the transmitter had 4 eyebrows over where the meters used to be. It was something.
Yeah, I called that a core meltdown, when the tuning screws melted and pulled the sliders up, and then as they melted more and it got hotter, the sliders would adjust it even more, and eventually it would just burn up.
Good old RCA fire starters.
Or as a good friend of mine, Walt Palmer, no silent key, used to say, real crappy apparatus.
Now, this is purely anecdotal, Grady, but can you tell us something about what you heard off the air, having used these different modes?
Well, thank you. I was going to include this information earlier in the presentation, and I was afraid this would happen. I completely forgot. WUMB-FM is trying to cover the entire number 10 market in America, Boston, Massachusetts, with 166 watts from 500 feet on the southeast corner of town. My job that they tasked me with when I got the job in 1982 or 83, when it only been on the air for a year, was to do all the possible thinking I could to minimize interference, self-interference, and maximize the useful coverage area of the radio station. So yes, there's a lot of listening tests that have gone into this, all I can tell you is our radio station doesn't show up in the book very well at all. It's down in the noise. Sometimes we make a 0.2 or a 0.3 share. I mean, it's unbelievable. But we have a big budget because we have an audience that supports us with their dollars, and so we serve them. But when they give us money at the level that they're giving us money, you can bet that if they were having signal issues, they would let us know. And I will tell you that when I was running the version 3 single sideband, which is the smooth 12K, when I was running that, we had no complaints about audio quality at all. All of our complaints were from people who were saying, where's my song title and artist? And we heard from them regularly because, you know, that's a system where each transmitter site gets its own data, and then your RBDS generator is plugging it in at that particular location. So you can lose one without losing the other. And the big problem is when you've got 9 transmitter sites all over eastern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire, and people say, I'm not getting the song title and artist, and you don't know where they are, it's an awful job.
Well, I wish that I had known some of this 50 years ago when I was building FM stations.
I'm thinking this would be wonderful stuff back in the 60s and 70s when we actually had terrific receivers, great Murat's 10B tuners, and actually people who listened in hi-fi instead of earbuds. I remember, there were hi-fi magazines that rated radio stations based on their quality. I don't see those anymore.
We used to have a magazine in LA called FM and Fine Arts, which
Yes.
it was an interesting name for a magazine, long gone, of course.
This is a little bit sidetracking, but we're going to have another discussion in some weeks ahead from now about the question of the modulation wars being over and the radios, particularly in cars, making a much bigger difference than you can make with your modulation level. But that's another story altogether. Any questions for Grady? Any comments about the single sideband approach to FM and the fact that it's already in one of the processors that a lot of people really like?
It's also in the 9SG as well. The 9 and the 9SG is using Hans's back-end clipper system. So anything that's using Stereo Tool or 9 or 9SG is all has that stuff there.
Was that all Leif, or did you have a figure in it, Corny?
No, I didn't do anything with the 9. That's pretty much Leif. Right now, it's Leif's front end and a lot of Hans's stuff. So
I know I saw the what became the 9 one year just after he had brought it out, and I was just stunned by the amount of diagnostic material that's in there. And so when you can take it and do things like what Grady is showing, it does open the opportunity to solve certain problems.
Hey, Barry.
Yes, sir.
I noticed that Jeff Mendenhall is on, and I was really curious. First of all, I wanted to say hello to Jeff because I'm a big fan. I was curious if he had any comments because of his background. Well, maybe he has walked away.
No, I just unmuted. There we go.
Hello, Jeff. Good
Hello.
to see you.
Hi, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces. Good to see you all. Nice job, Grady. So I'm not a regular here, but I decided to drop in and see what you guys are doing. So it's all good.
So as Lark asked, what's your impression of what Grady showed as regards what you wrote so many years back?
You're talking about single sideband FM or just the whole synchronous AM and group delay topic? I mean, the synchronous AM and group delay thing is probably pretty much gone away with solid state transmitters, which have tremendous bandwidth, so you don't worry about that anymore.
I
kind of moved out to the antenna.
I believe you still have to worry about that in combined facilities.
Yeah.
And places where you have to have traps. For instance, at WUMB, WGBH has 100 kilowatts at 89.7, and we're at 91.9, and we're within 40 feet of the same height. And there is so much energy being picked up by my antenna going back into that transmitter that I had to put a cavity filter in there. But on the other hand, I really, really wanted the best symmetry of my passband that I could get. And when I ordered the filter to go on the wall from Shively, they made the notch as deep as they could, and it really messed up my group delay. and I had to drive that filter back up to Maine and have them retune it, because what I wanted was the most symmetrical passband and then whatever amount of notch they could put in without messing up the passband in my channel.
Well, yeah, you bring up a good point. There's still multi-station combiners and notch filters, and yeah, they can wreak havoc on the group delay response. I think a lot of the manufacturers include all pass networks to correct or flatten the group delay. I remember some years ago at Harris with our RTAC, real-time adaptive correction, we actually could correct for group delay around the filter by just moving the sampling point back to the exciter beyond the combiner, and we could include that in part of the adaptive pre-correction. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but I would imagine, you know, Gates Air and Nautel and the others who have adaptive pre-correction might have an option for doing group delay correction around filters as well.
The receiver is still very much a wild card. Just throwing that in there, we're starting to see software-defined receivers showing up even in automobile dashes, as evidenced by the fact that Ford was able to restore AM by simply changing the software and apparently doing nothing to the hardware. So I'm wondering how many receivers have kind of looked at this, or do we have any idea what the technology is in the receivers we're looking at it with? I'm sure it's not the old style lumped constant filters with 12AX7s anymore, but lots changing.
What I ran into with the receivers now is, for a lot of them, this seems to be probably in response to HD radio and the noises you can get into the main channel from it if your filters are too wide. A lot of them are very narrow now, like really narrow, and that causes a problem for people who like to step on the gas, if you will, and go beyond their normal modulation, which then causes all these issues that Grady talks about, but it happens in the radio, and it really trashes up the audio. So a lot of people think that it's good to go beyond your 100% modulation. Well, they're just trashing their audio for most people because it's just bumping right into these filter skirts in the radios now, which are really tight now.
I suspect on FM HD, however, they need the bandwidth to get the carriers, but not in typical mono receiver.
Well, or you would need them when you're decoding HD, but for the analog sections of the radios, they really just solve the problems of having noises from the HD carrier there by just making the IF strips a lot narrower, which means you don't really have a lot of wiggle room as a radio station to overmodulate anymore. People don't think about that. Sorry, I said you can chime in, Grady. I just kind of chopped in there.
That shades of the old whistle problem, which destroyed AM's bandwidth.
Lucky we didn't go to 9 kilohertz spacing.
A lot of good points, aren't they? Realizing that broadcasting it's a mixture. It's a mixture of the audio and the transmission system, and the part perhaps that some of the younger guys don't get as yet is you've got to match them all. And we could start with AM, and especially with directionals, the common point. You move off 5 kilohertz from that common point, and where are you? You could be in a very strange place in terms of the radiation. Then we move to FM, and here we have to talk about, as Grady said, combined sites where transmitters are so close in frequency that you're jamming all kinds of RF back into the final. Here in Tucson, I think the one station that I was working about 20 years ago had 7 or 8 filters on the output, because each time another station came up and did something, that's what the engineer of that time chose to do. And by the time you get 7 or 8 filters, that's a challenge to put through your signal.
Plus, the wider bandwidth transmitters also have, in a way, created a problem because they're more likely to have problems with RF coming back down the pipe from a strong local signal. I know 1110 didn't have anything in it until they went to the solid state transmitter. Then all of a sudden we had to put a notch in to get rid of KTNQ because it was mixing, whereas before it was never an issue.
That's 1020 and 1110.
Yeah, that's highly dependent on the combining scheme that's used in the solid state transmitters. There are some combining schemes that route the inbound interferer to the reject loads and have better turnaround loss. That's another whole subject, is turnaround loss on tube and solid state transmitters.
Sounds like we ought to invite you back to talk about some of these things, Chad.
I'm pretty out of date these days.
Well, yes.
I can talk more about ham radio and SDRs than that.
I noticed a Heathkit phone patch in the rack. I noticed that.
Yeah, I still use that. We have one ham radio friend that's been ill. He's been in a nursing home, and he wants to be in our net. So I put him on every Thursday night. Tonight's Thursday. He'll be back on my Heathkit phone patch, and it's on one of the inputs to my mixer, and it works great. I could use Skype, but this guy does not. He's not into iPads and computers. He's into landline phones. Although the connection to my house is an IP phone, which then is converted to copper to go to the Heathkit.
Now, is this a local net?
Yeah, it's not local to me. I live up on Catawba Island on west end of Lake Erie, but it's the Cincinnati Amateur Radio Association, Greater Cincinnati Amateur Radio Association's 1936 net. It's a 160-meter net that's been on since the year 1936. You're welcome. Anybody can get on 160 at 9 o'clock tonight Eastern time. Barring QRN, depending on where you are. Right now, some of the guys that check in from Western Colorado are having a rough time because it's way before sunset for them. It's barely sunset here.
They could probably use the SDRs at KPH, although right now our Marconi T is down. We just have a loop, but the SDRs at KPH and Point Reyes are literally in the Pacific Ocean. So I like to say the only harmful emissions out there are from the cattle, and it's not in the RF domain.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Grady, I'm curious about that Detroit station that Glenn designed the array for. Do you know which one it was?
I keep losing call letters in my brain. I probably have stuff on my hard drive here somewhere that I could dig up. Let me look after we're done here. I've got another event. I've got to go out to the McAuliffe Center this afternoon. There's a big celebration presentation thing happen at the Krista McAuliffe thing out at Framingham State University, and I'm helping with that. So I'm gonna have to leave in a little while, but I'll dig that up and maybe I'll have it for next week.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that if it's the one I'm thinking of, one of the guys I work with at TM went up there. It was a 12-tower array.
Was that WWJ you're thinking?
That doesn't sound
Okay.
what I'm thinking of.
Okay.
WC something, and not FL.
So one of my things that I since I'm very much interested in the history of radio and how we got there, it didn't just happen. There's a whole lot of things. But those of us that find ourselves stuck get into World Radio History website, I don't recommend going there if you have nothing else to do for the rest of the day. But they do have scanned most of a magazine called FM and Television, dating from the 40s up through and I haven't read myself through most of it yet, but how they made things work in those days before they had all of the test equipment and knowledge we have today is pretty amazing. So I really think that the Zenith FM stereo system was a genius idea because it actually worked, and it may not have been perfect. And we're looking back now from 60 years of history, but the fact that they were able to come up with a way that was to retain the existing mono FM and still give us stereo, I think that was genius. And I don't want to denigrate at all that whole concept. Yep, we know a lot more about it now than we did 60 years ago, but still, it worked.
A lot like NTSC. It ain't pretty, but it's pretty amazing.
Well, and also, when FM stereo first came out, the only receivers that got stereo were sitting in your living room. So nobody was thinking about having a radio in the car, picking up FM stereo, and all of the distortion problems that happen with that.
And of course, most of the stereo stations, actually most of the FMs, had subcarriers running Muzak,
Mm-hmm.
which raised hell with a lot of receivers.
Yeah. And while we're talking about FM stereo and everything else, I just want to point out a couple of months ago, California Historical Radio Society had a presentation by Jim Gabbert, who will, of course, explain that he invented FM stereo and everything else, but as a pioneer in FM radio and a lot of other things, I think you can find the YouTube of that presentation if you're interested in looking a little bit into the history of FM and KPEN that became K101.
Yeah, San Francisco has a great history of pioneering FM. I used to program KABL from TM in Dallas, and it's interesting. Bob Beamish's name was mentioned. I remember Bob.
Otherwise known as Robert C. Beamwith.
Now, Barry, that's the Detroit station?
Yep.
Got the call letters wrong. I seem to remember it was one of the former CBS stations that he did that. I got the wrong call signs.
No, I remember it being 12 towers. Unless some of them got stolen.
Don't anybody look in my garage, okay?
Been in Jasper lately?
The one that was 12, as I remember, was FDF. The one that came down from no, it's showing 8 there.
From Flint.
Flint, yeah.
That was my doing.
Well, I'm sure the call letters have changed 11 or 12 times.
Or maybe they took towers down. I remember knowing there was at least 9. Well,
I think didn't KLIF have 11? Dallas?
Well, that's the famous one, KLIF.
Yeah, that used to be a Susquehanna station, and I've heard wonderful stories about Fred Graves and that tower and that array.
I don't know if it's still KLIF or not. Oh no, it isn't.
No, it was an amazing station in its day. Oh, just
That was back in the Gordon McClendon days.
Yeah.
Was its day.
yes, it was.
Dave Holtzman was the one that put that together.
Yeah, KLIF and KNUS.
And you know how I know? And this is so weird. I was on the air on 1190 in Phoenix, and one night I started getting phone calls from everywhere, and turned out every other 1190 in the country was off the air for maintenance except me. 250 watts. I covered the country. Had calls from New York, Boston. I had one from Detroit. Weird night. There's their 12.
There are stories about a plane trying to land between the towers of Cliff. They thought it was a landing strip with the rows of red lights.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, this is exactly why the National Public Warning System relies on AM. If you wipe out all the other stations because there's no power, just those 77 sites are really going to cover the country quite well. You're also going to wipe out all those LED light bulbs and everything that are interfering.
Ooh, I'm glad I'm not a radio station right now. I just got hit by lightning very close by.
So why would you want to have a 12 tower array?
Because that was how they tried to hit Dallas. That was pencil beam into Dallas. I don't know if I've got a picture of the Dallas market overlaid here, but this is I don't know how many miles out was that. Does anybody remember?
Rockwall's about 30 miles east of downtown
Yeah.
Dallas. The old joke about that array was, you look at the main lobe, it used to go right down Interstate 30 without hitting either curb.
Well, we had that with WMEX in Boston. You know, very tight down the center lane of the Mass Turnpike.
Wow.
Yeah. Ken Fine was told me one day that you could hear this up in Dallas, you could not hear it in Fort Worth.
Yes. Yeah.
Somewhere I've got a coverage pattern, but I don't know where that is right now.
Well, I'm not sure it would work today because almost everything in Dallas has moved north.
Well, this is still way out there. This one. Still 12 towers.
I think there are two of them, one in Detroit and one in Dallas.
There was one, it was right next door to the Kmart, and I think 3 of those sticks are down. That was the 1500, I think, in Detroit.
Yeah, I remember it being high on the dial.
All makes me thankful that I had a simpler life.
Well, wouldn't it, rather than 12 towers, wouldn't lower power with fewer reach Dallas from 30 miles away?
I think it was a question of who they had to protect at night and still be on the air. Other stories, well, in the days when I worked in Dallas, because they had their challenges with keeping that array in spec. There were stories of calibrating the grass and things, all kinds of interesting stories at the SVE meetings back in the day.
I think the reason for that high directionality was so they could say 50 kilowatts day and night.
Yeah, remember they were in Dallas, but they had to cover what? Fort Wayne, Indiana. They had to protect Portland. They had to protect Kesey, Anaheim. Phoenix didn't get a whole lot of protection, but there was a little bit there. Then you go southeast, and there's more protection. And of course, off to New York, and you got 1190 out there.
Yeah,
Another
those of us on the very left coast, it's really easy to have a directional antenna here because you just point it all west and you don't have to worry about it. But when you're in the Midwest, you got to cover every direction. So you have more complicated things. It's easy in San Francisco, you just need to have a null going east.
According to Bob Burnham, before they took 3 of these sticks down, they had tremendous troubles with this because contactors failed, the switching system failed. It was running in one mode for a long period of time, allegedly. But that's what's left is, and then when I saw it, there are gapes in the fence and people were walking dogs out there.
Well, the signal you want is WBZ in Boston, pointing west from the ocean.
An awful lot of East Coast stations pointed east.
Well, with WOR, we were pointing, let's see, primarily south, because when it was engineered, it was intended to serve New York and Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't much care about anything else. And actually, it almost didn't happen. Bamberger's was about ready to shut it down.
Well, a lot of stations were